Hello and welcome to episode 90 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have confirmation about the Miami Heretics. Vamos is underway in the CDL. We also have some COD adjacent news or potential COD adjacent news relating to the Los Angeles Guerrillas parent organization and the LA Gladiators in the Overwatch League. So something to keep an eye on there that we will talk about later in the show. We also have some potential game mode, change ups in the CDL, which would be pretty interesting if they do end up going through. That we'll get to, and we might touch on some of the stuff that Clayster said in a recent interview that kind of caught attention on social media if we have time. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bank?
I'm doing all right. Vamos is in order, and we can hop right in.
Yeah, the biggest news of the week, the real only confirmed news that we got out of the CDL this past week since our last show was that the Florida Mutineers are now the Miami Heretics. Heretics, the Spanish organization that was previously a part of the CWL back before the CDL formed. Heretics has merged with the Mutineers and have taken over that slot to create an all-Spanish team based out of Miami, and that will be rebranded as the Miami Heretics. The roster right now is Eric Boom, Journey, Lucky, Meadows, and Vickle. So that's 5. Obviously, somebody will have to go to the bench, which I don't believe has been confirmed here nor there so far. And Methods Sick, who previously was part of the Heretics roster when they were part of the CWL. He will be a coach, and I believe Noel will also be a coach. He wasn't a part of the announcement, but he's a part of the COD wiki, which is, I'm going off of that as well. So a pretty interesting development. Of course, we knew a lot of what was going to happen, or we thought we knew what was going to happen months ago when it was originally reported that Heretics was going to take over the Mutineers spot. But it looked like a little bit there that this would not actually go through and that the Mutineers might keep their spot or sell it to someone else. But we did end up with the Heretics taking over the spot, forming the Miami Heretics, and creating an all-Spanish lineup, which is the first time that's happened in the CDL, of course. And they will undoubtedly be one of, if not the only all-European team in the CDL this coming season, because we have a lot of mixed rosters at the moment, and we have for the last few seasons. So what are your thoughts on the Miami Heretics, their roster, and the way they might be approaching their kind of emergence into the CDL?
Yeah, I'm excited for the potential of the Heretics brand and what that brings to the table. As we've already joked within the first couple minutes of the podcast here tonight, the Vamos was just exploding in chat with literally just a simple message like "Vamos, let's go" in Spanish. Back when Heretics was in the CWL, and they have a passionate fan base, and the potential to tap into that is definitely interesting to see how that will translate to the CDL now. But I do have to say I did really like the Mutineers branding, and I thought they did a nice job trying to connect with fans and stuff through videos and social media and stuff like that. But I did, just the actual Mutineers brand. I definitely am going to miss that, but I do think that Heretics has the potential to fill its shoes well, and if not even exceed what what Mutineers is capable of, just because of tapping into that Spanish fan base that they have. So I am excited. I do think it's worth mentioning, like you said, they have 5 players right now, and I think maybe the initial report said that Vickle would start on the bench, but it's probably too early to speculate. And if it was me with this team, I would probably go into MW3 with a completely open mind. When you're in a position like this where you have 5 capable starters, you kind of give yourself some time to potentially, mess around with different roster iterations and stuff like that before the season actually starts. You can scrim with a set of 4 guys one day, the next day scrim with another set, different set of 4 players, or however you want to do it, and you can see what works best when the game is actually released. So, as opposed to being a team that has a coach who is a sub, you don't really have that same opportunity. But when you have let's just say in a world where Dickel is a sub, he was literally competing in the CDL last year, so he's a more than capable substitute, and definitely a more than capable starter too. So definitely interesting to see how that all plays out, but that will be months down the road. For now, I just think it is interesting that we have the Heretics brand back, and it has a lot of potential. I was just thinking about it too. There was something tied to a Heretics announcement, which it might have been something in like translation or whatnot, but there was like something in the message like saying like you'll be playing in January from Miami or something like that. And I think people were talking on social media about, does that mean like the CDL starting in January this year, which would be later than the early start we got last year. So there was some speculation around that, but I think we'll probably just have to wait to hear official news on that down the road as well.
Yeah, hopefully not, because that would be hell on earth to go another 3 months without any competitive COD, and just not. I'm not digging that, but I am a fan of the Heretics brand and kind of the attitude of the Heretics, in the sense that this is a Spanish organization, and they are in one of, if not the biggest, Spanish speaking market now in Miami. Of course, there's a difference between Spanish people and like Latino people, and specifically in Miami, a lot of Cuban Americans. But in the same vein, like being able to market in another language and it be authentic to that language, I think that is an important aspect that the CDL doesn't really have, obviously, because no other, like, we have 2 countries involved in the CDL at the moment, the United States and Canada, and, or I guess 3, but who knows what London is going to do. But regardless, like every team and every franchise is marketed toward English speaking fans and just English speaking COD fans. Whereas a lot of these other esports, you look at League of Legends, of course, like there's Korean fans, there's Chinese fans, there's all of the European, I believe Heretics has an LEC team, so they have market in Spain, and they're marketing towards Spanish fans. But of course, like the LEC is based out of Berlin, Germany, and you have fans all over Europe. Where the CDL is just not an international entity at this moment. Regardless of Paris formerly being part of the CDL, and London, so far currently still being part of the CDL. Everything is basically focused on America and American consumers, and in one very big Canadian city. But still, like everything is pretty much based on America, and I think it's cool at least to market toward it, even if it's still in America, to market towards Spanish speaking people and kind of try to spread it out and try to reach new fans, if anything. And I think it's a pretty cool experience that Heretics will be around, and they have an all Spanish roster. Everybody speaks Spanish. It's just it's a pretty intriguing way to market your team. Something that we discussed back in the day about the Paris Legion, and how they had no French players aside from Brezi, who never played. So like the connection to the local city you're supposed to be representing is nothing when you do something like that. And we saw it with London in the first few seasons, where they only had English players or British players. They only had players that would be kind of authentic and local to the team, even if they weren't playing from London. And we don't see that very much at all in the CDL, because everyone is pretty much based out of Dallas or LA, or maybe the cities that they're supposed to be representing. But I'd say probably half the league is in Dallas, and there's no real connection to those cities. So maybe this is a step in the right direction. Of course, I think we both agree that the city names and everything would be better off. We would be better off without those. But at the moment, if we're going to continue on, the Miami Heretics probably have a leg up on a lot of these other teams because they have people that could actually speak the language that a lot of people in Miami can speak on top of English as well. So I think it's a pretty cool idea for the Heretics, and I'm very much looking forward to how they do in the CDL. I didn't know if you had anything else before we move on to the next topic.
Just on that note, too, considering how they could potentially do in the CDL, I definitely think it's, without having the results page pulled up in front of me, I was thinking about it whenever we were getting ready to write the article about it, though. I feel like, Heretics was a heavy underdog when it was in the CWL, just because a lot of people didn't really know about these Spanish players, didn't know what they were capable of. And they definitely had a couple of good moments. And I don't know if they had like any, podium finishes or anything like that, but I think they had, a couple of respectable like top 8, top 12 finishes during the CWL era. So I would expect a similar, expectation for this Heretic squad. I feel like they're going to come in, and if we had to do a power ranking today, they would probably be one of the teams towards the lower, back half of the 12-team power rankings. But I wouldn't be surprised at the same time if they came out and, just proved a lot of doubters wrong and stuff like that at the same time, just similar to how I feel like I remember Heretics operating and doing in the CWL. So I think that's, and again, I think it's similar to, questions about who these guys are, even though guys like Lucky and Metals and Journey were a part of that original Heretics team, and we did see, did Journey ever play in the CDL? I know he was not subbed for FaZe, so I don't think he actually played, but I know Lucky and Metals were on Toronto and played initially for that squad before like they made a couple changes, but nonetheless I feel like that's I don't know if you agree or not, but I feel like that's how coming into this season a lot of people will probably rank them towards the bottom half, have lower expectations for them, but they could definitely upset the status quo and cause some upsets.
Of course, because all these players are coming from challengers. They haven't been in the CDL. Some of them haven't ever been in the CDL, and then, of course, some were in the CWL or very early stages of the COD League. But in challengers, they were all reasonably successful. Eric Boom and Metals both got to the challengers grand finals, the challengers champs grand finals, and lost to GOAT team. And Journey and Lucky were both on in that tournament as well, of course, and they ended up finishing top 15. So, either way, I think just in general, I don't think that they were ever going to be able to get this all-star roster without breaking the bank, really. And I'm talking about the Mutineers or the Heretics, but really it's for any other team. Like FaZe had their guys locked down. Optic had some of their guys locked down. Of course, you could have picked away at the LAT roster or the Seattle rosters, but at the end of the day, like you're not gonna just overnight create this all-star championship roster in the CDL unless you're probably Atlanta, Optic, LAT, or New York having a championship roster by itself, and then doing that, or Toronto maybe. But like I didn't see the Mutineers or the Heretics doing anything to be a championship contender, and I think this is the way to go if you can't do that. I don't think that this is a roster that's going to win a championship, and I probably don't think it's going to be a roster that's going to be at the very, very bottom. Like I think they're probably going to be right about where the Mutineers were this year, where they're maybe fighting for a champ spot, and that's really not like a I'm not trying to put them down or anything, because the CDL is very competitive. There are a lot of really good teams in the CDL now because we haven't expanded, but the talent keeps increasing and the level of play keeps increasing. So I just think that we're at a point where, of course, they're probably going to be in the bottom half of the CDL, and that's just to be expected. Maybe they can exceed those expectations and people are going to really be surprised at what Heretics can do. But I think just in general, if you're not going to be able to win a championship or put together a championship level roster immediately, why not try to market your team in a unique manner so people can kind of connect to it, and then maybe at some point you can kind of build up to becoming a championship team and having that roster that can compete with FaZe or compete with Optic or Toronto or New York or something like that. So I'm a big fan of this strategy for Miami at this point in time. The only other team in the CDL that we really wanted to talk about today was the LA Guerrillas, and it's really not them specifically, but the team, for the organization that they're a part of, which is the Guard. If you've been listening to our podcast for, that was probably like 6 months ago at this point. So if you've been listening, this season, this entire year, you probably remember us talking about it at the time. But the Guard, a while ago, they pretty much laid off every single person in their organization, aside from maybe like a manager or two. Like, it really was a pretty widespread layoff for the Guard. And that's at that time, Stan Kroenke and Kroenke Sports Entertainment, the owners of the Guard and the owners of the LA Guerrillas in the CDL and the LA Gladiators in the OWL. Kroenke Sports Entertainment pretty much was like, yeah, we're not going to do this esports thing anymore. We're going to pull out. And that was the report, at least. And the layoffs came back, and that seemed to be the case. And today it came down from Riot that the Guard's Valorant team would not be promoted to Valorant Champions Tour Americas, which is the LCS, for a lack of a better example, for Valorant. This is the North America, or the I guess it's North and South America, the very best Valorant teams in the region. And it's a franchise league and all of that, or a partnered league, not a franchise. But the Guards Valorant team cannot be a part of it, and the reports were that it was based on the Guard not completing the paperwork and doing the process to get access to or to be granted access into this league, which just seems unfathomable. Like, I don't like doing my taxes, but I do them anyway, just because I know I have to. And it just seems just baffling in general that this might have happened. Your thoughts on kind of just like all of this, because it doesn't make sense. It makes sense from the standpoint that we know that the Guard is having issues and that they've had issues for the last 6 months to a year. But in the same vein, this was the way for this organization to maybe live in just kind of a very small sense, just live on in Valorant and be able, and of course, like, the players are getting screwed here the most, like, because the players that are a part of the Guards Valorant team are not going to keep that spot. The spot kind of just goes away, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think the closest example would probably be like Denial Esports in, like, what was that, 2018, 2019, where they weren't paying for their players or paying for the spot. And then it got like the players, I don't even think, got to keep it. It went to another team. It's just like, this entire situation just seems like such so crazy and such a mess. What are your thoughts on it, as someone obviously that covers esports and edits all these articles and stuff?
Yeah, so my head's kind of in a similar place to what you were just talking about a little earlier. Although we've had the reports of the layoffs and stuff like that earlier this year. We've never really heard official confirmation from Cronky Sports Entertainment or, the Guard or anything like that of those reports, or whether they are or aren't going to continue in the CDL and stuff like that. But this is just a really bad look, in my opinion, and it kind of is a giant red flag for the potential future of the Guerrillas, and at the same time, just the OWL team, the Gladiators too. But for the sake of our podcast, we'll focus on the Guerrillas. Just because, like, if not pretending to be a Valorant expert here by any stretch of the imagination, but from my basic understanding, they are calling it a partnership league. It's essentially franchising, but it's called partnership. And I believe there were 30 spots of this. This was the first year of the partnership era in Valorant. And I believe there were 30 spots that you partner with Riot for, spread across 3 regions. I think next year, even now, China's being added as a region, so there's going to be more teams. But there was like a set path to pro system where the tier 2 teams, or the challengers teams, would compete through a tournament, I believe, called Ascension, and the winner of that tournament would get a temporary spot in essentially the Pro League, which is what happened with the Guards. The Guard won that tournament, and they would essentially have won a 2-year spot in the partnership system before, and then after 2 years, if just that team would go away, and if the players were moved to different teams in the Pro League or whatever, they would be around, but just that quote unquote franchise spot would no longer exist. They aren't like a permanent partner like the other 10 teams that are already established. So that's a pretty big deal, right? If the Guards team wins that, they essentially are the best tier 2 team in the America's challenger system, and that essentially means they would be the 11th team, so essentially the 11th best team at worst in the entire region. And if you can't do the necessary work to lock down that spot, and we not going to sit here and pretend to know exactly what they had to do, but it didn't seem like it was anything outlandish from my understanding of the reports and stuff from today. It seemed like there was like communication issues or whatever, and not just not agreeing or whatnot. So I don't really know what happened there, but it's just a big red flag to me for what's going on with the Guard, and what could potentially happen with the Guerrillas organization, because if they can't do the necessary work to just have this partnership spot in the league that they won, it's not even like they had to buy the spot, right? Like they actually their team earned it for them. What does that mean for this next year, where we haven't even heard very much about a potential Guerrillas lineup where they have to actually pay these players to join their team for the next year, and then pay that salary throughout the season? Obviously, they were paying the Guard players, I believe, because I believe that was the initial report, that they were still keeping on the Guerrillas roster and the Valorant roster at the time of the layoffs. But yeah, it's really concerning for me in terms of what this could potentially mean for the CDL. We've heard the rumors of the layoffs, and potentially, it means the Guard sells the CDL spot, and then we have another new franchise coming in, which that's at this point, that's potentially an exciting possibility if there's issues going on with the Guard. But this just definitely is a big red flag in my book. And I feel like I was trying to be one of the more optimistic people multiple times on this podcast over the last couple of months. Just we've talked at length now about how how much money Stan Kroenke actually has, and they had the success with the Nuggets winning a championship this year. And I'm like, hey, maybe things will turn around. They just won an NBA championship. Maybe they'll be like, okay, we'll stick around with esports for another year, yada yada. But this is just this is very concerning. Obviously, I feel bad for those Valorant players involved in this situation, because kind of like you said, this is an opportunity of a lifetime for them, especially just getting that chance to earn a spot to be a pro. We've seen that countless times with like relegation and stuff throughout the years and multiple esports. It's a really cool storyline, and in terms of having this challengers or amateur team rise up to earn a spot in the professional league, but they're essentially being robbed of this opportunity because of something going on potentially with the organization. So the one positive you can take away from this from the Valorant perspective is that, especially if this team was so good in the in terms of winning that challengers tournament, maybe some, if not all, of those players get picked up on another partnered team that's already established. I mean, maybe you could even see something similar to the Heretics, like we're just talking about, where maybe like a team that's already partnered in the Americas League for Valorant just squad wipes their team and they pick up the guards lineup, right? Um, so that's potentially one positive for the guys, especially if you take into consideration the potential red flags with the organization, the uncertainty around that. Let's just say, just for the sake of a lack of an example, I know this isn't a good example, so I'm not going to say it. I was going to say Sentinels, but there was like that report of Sentinels like crowdfunding money or whatever. But I can't think of any of the other America's Valorant teams off the top of my head. I think Evil Geniuses is just one, so this would be a really bad example. And there's been controversy around EG2, so I don't want to say that either. But let's just say that the Preston Byers esports organization is partnered in Valorant, is really successful. It is just a notable organization and stuff. If you get an opportunity to go to an organization that has a good reputation, as opposed to having to deal with these uncertainties and stuff like that, that's potentially a positive out of this, the very dark and uncertain situation you're in here, where it looks like you might not have a spot. So definitely lots of red flags and everything surrounding this situation. But at the end of the day, yeah, I feel bad for the guys involved on that team. Hope everything works out for them. And I'm definitely concerned, probably more than I was earlier this year, about what this could potentially mean for the Guerrillas in the CDL.
Yeah, the Riot explanation, this is the head of Global Esports. He tweeted like a long tweet, because I think he's a Twitter blue guy, but it was he basically explained why the team was excluded entirely, and Riot did not decide to pick up the runners up of the Ascension, which was M80. So pretty much the challengers promotion, like they decided not to pick up the team that won it or the team that came in second. And they did not allow the team to sell the spot to another organization, so that those same players that earned the spot, they could continue on and be a part of the VCT America's League. And he basically explained it as they don't allow any team to sell their spot. So the CDL is like completely different, because everybody is pretty much has sold their spot at this point or changed locations or something. So the CDL is just so unique in that aspect. But so no, they can't sell the spot, and I guess they're not even allowing the Guard to release these players outright and then sign with a new organization, because then I guess like they're circumventing the rule, right? I guess is the idea behind that. They also didn't want to promote M80 because they said that would create questionable precedents, because the point of Ascension is to reward performance, which is super ironic considering they are disqualifying the first place team and the second place team. Like, you would think the first place team would get in based on performance. And I think the other reason was that they don't treat this situation as if they were a free agent team. We've seen it in the challengers scene before, where it's just like a made up team name, like team, what was that team? The European one that everybody loved.
Bobs or whatever.
No, I was talking about what was it? It was like in, I think like 2019 or 2020, and it was like the all European, or all the English players, and it was one player in particular. I can't think of it. I'll search it up afterwards. But they were just a team of guys. They were not an organization.
Quicker. Team Quicker.
Yeah, Team Quicker. They were not an organization. They were just playing under his name so they could play together. They could compete in the tournament. I guess in Riot's case, they would allow that. because then that team would have to look for an organization to play under for the next season of VCT Americas. But because this team was under the Guard for the entire season, that is not going to be allowed in this case. Either way, I think this is really, really stupid because the players earned it. The organization didn't do crap for them. Like, I'm sure they paid them or whatever. Maybe. We don't know. But even then, like, these players were the ones that won it. This is punishing players for the actions of management and ownership. And I never think that should be the case. That happens a lot with college football, where current players are not allowed to go to bowl games or not allowed to participate in certain things because of past coaches or past athletic directors or whatever, or past players that did something bad and the NCAA wants to punish them. I just think that this is a bad precedent, and not just for Valorant, but just esports as a whole. Like, players that earn a spot in a league, especially when it's such a lucrative, such an exclusive spot. So something like the CDL or the CWL, obviously you can't get into the CDL with like a ragtag group of players anymore, but it used to be able, you used to be able to do this in the CWL. And I always thought that the players should own their spot. If they want to sell off a spot, then they should be able to do that. But players, more so than organizations, should be at the forefront of this. And I do have concerns about the Guard and the LA Guerrillas, to loop this back to the CDL, because what is going on over there? Like, we've had concerns about the Minnesota RØKKR and what might have been happening, you know, how a lot of content creators and a lot of people in the front office within the Minnesota and version 1, they departed and they're no longer part of the Minnesota RØKKR version 1 organizations. So I had a lot of concerns about whether they were going to stick around, whether they were preparing for a merger or a sale. But then we've heard stuff about their roster and how they might be picking up Accuracy and all these other players. So that gives me hope that they're planning on sticking around. They want to be a part of the CDL in some way. I've not heard a single thing about the Guerrillas since that early off-season report about how Illy and Arstes were like a team of two, but now they're linked to other teams, and I just have no idea what to do with the Guerrillas at this point. I mean, it's just, it shows so much about the people that got involved in esports and why they got involved, because I think you can look at Optic and FaZe. Like, I really think that they're bought into Call of Duty. Like, the idea of Call of Duty esports is important to them. Of course, making money is important to them, and Atlanta FaZe or FaZe Clan in general has not been very good at that lately, but the idea of Call of Duty esports, in my opinion, is probably pretty important to them and their identity. But with some of these other organizations that came in and thought that they would make a quick buck on Call of Duty or esports as a whole, they're being exposed one by one as just chasing money and not really caring about their players that they signed, that they, you know, kind of swore to protect and kind of support in general. And now we're looking at another team in the CDL potentially going away, you know, or selling their spot or what have you. And that would make over half of the league, maybe. Like, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Like, NRG Esports was originally part of the CDL. They were the owners of the Chicago Huntsmen, and then they sold it to Envy, and then Envy obviously sold their spot to Boston, which is Oxygen Esports, Robert Kraft. And some of these organizations are merging, getting rid of their teams. Of course, we have the Heretics that we just talked about earlier in this show. They're coming in to replace Misfits, who Heretics and Misfits, they made a deal with their LEC spot last year, so like they had that previous connection. Who knows what's going on with London and Rect Global and all of that. I feel decently confident about the subliners, and Envy, I feel very confident in keeping Call of Duty as part of their core, considering Castro is a Call of Duty guy through and through, and Hex isn't a Call of Duty guy through and through. And then LAT came in after that first season, replacing Fake Optic Infinite Esports. So like we're in this cycle of every season, every off season, we have to deal with a new team or a new rebrand or something changing drastically, like the Paris Legion moving to Vegas, moving and then, trying to kind of rebrand and everything. But I'm done ranting. I'm just saying, like, this entire situation with Riot is not exclusive to Riot and Valorant. This is stuff that really is probably going to happen with the Call of Duty League, or if the CDL goes away and we bring back the CWL or something similar in this open aspect where we have relegation and promotion. Like, I think we might run into some of the same issues. I don't know if you had anything else to say on the topic.
I just wanted to say I don't fully again don't know all the business ins and outs, especially for this deal. But you saying I can't remember exactly what you said. The Riot had said about the not being able to sell the spot or whatever, but it's not like spots in Riot leagues haven't been sold or acquired by other organizations previously. A big example is the Echo Fox LCS spot. There were some behind the scenes stuff with like an owner and Rick Fox like fighting or whatever that situation was, like racial slurs being thrown around and stuff like that. It was a weird situation, but that spot was sold to I can't think of it.
I don't. Was it
Clutch Gaming? I think it was the Rockets organization, but no, I don't know if that's right.
Was it FlyQuest?
No. Echo Fox sold.
Dignitas?
Oh, Evil Geniuses.
Oh, yep. Yeah. So, Cronky Sports Entertainment in 2019 agreed to purchase the LCS spot from Echo Fox, and then, due to legal issues with their partner Sentinels, then Evil Geniuses was picked. So, Cronky Sports Entertainment at the center of every one of these things.
But even beyond that, even this most recent season of the LCS2, there was CLG merged with NRG, and NRG just won the summer split for the LCS and then returned to the LCS.
And then TSM is reportedly selling, right?
Yeah. They're reportedly looking to move to another region, potentially China. So my thinking there is potentially maybe any rules around the sale and stuff like that might be because this isn't a permanent partnership spot. Like I was saying, it's only like a 2-year thing, so maybe like legally they can't sell a spot that's not a permanent spot. That would be weird. I don't really know. Not trying to make excuses or anything, but that just to say that it's not like spots in Riot leagues have not been sold or acquired by other organizations, so that shouldn't be an issue unless there's something like beyond what we know that's causing this to be held up. And that the first thing that comes to mind is potentially because it's not a permanent spot.
I just think it's a Riot thing, like where they when they created this league, they're like, they're not going to be sold. So they made this decision. Maybe they put it in the operating agreement or something with these teams that were the initial partner teams. And maybe like, I'm just speculating. I don't want to say this is the case, but the wording is, this particular situation is different since this team played through Challengers and Ascension under the Guard banner and became free agents after the fact. Allowing an acquisition by a different organization now opens the door for slots in the VCT to be sold, which we do not allow. I don't, like, to me, that doesn't make any sense why you wouldn't allow it or have some kind of loophole in this situation where even if the Guard were to release their players, which they did. So say they release let's say they release their players, they don't pay their players anything. The players didn't get a cent from being released at all. So there's no financial commitment one way or the other. These players are all released and they decide on their own to seek out another organization. They're going to go to, let's say, the KC Armadillos, and they are going to sign contracts with the KC Armadillos. why could that not be allowed? If there's no money exchanging hands, the spot is not being sold. Like, this should not be tied to the guard. And it just doesn't make any sense in my mind why, like, even they're saying like it can't be sold, and even if it's not sold, it can't happen. And that to me makes no sense at all. And I think that it was a complete oversight on Riot's behalf, and it's only hurting it's hurting a lot of people, but it's hurting this team in particular, and it's hurting like their potential path to pro in a way of like it kind of ruins the integrity of it, because it's like if we had something in challengers where, oh, like the challengers team that wins challengers champs, they can be in the CDL next year, and then when that happens, like they win challengers champs and they're like, well, that org didn't file the paperwork, so those players are just getting bumped down to challengers and they can't come back up to the CDL as a team. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, and it's just a really stupid thing, and I feel really bad for them. I hope everything gets worked out. I hope Riot, changes their minds or is able to make an exception for this one time only or something, because it just seems like a really screwed up situation that really is like a make or break decision for a career. Like if you really think about it, like some of these players might not ever make it back up to this spot or this level of competition. And we've seen in the past before where guys would get relegated, or teams would get relegated out of the Call of Duty World League, or they wouldn't make it into the CDL, and they haven't been heard from again on this level before, or on this level again. And I think that there's always the chance that that could happen here with the Guard. But as far as the Guerrillas go, please just keep the people informed as to what's going on, because I think we should know by now at least whether they're going to even compete in the next season of the CDL, or obviously there are questions about how the CDL will operate with the Overwatch League reportedly coming to an end at the end of this year and everything. So like I would love some information from the CDL or information from the Guard or the Guerrillas about what exactly is going on at the end of this off season, and if this team is even going to field a roster. Like that would be really, really nice to know, don't you think?
I agree.
Let's talk about something else, because I think we've kind of exhausted our efforts with the Guard, and we have some RØKKR G2 stuff that we had forgotten about when we put together our notes originally. But this happened last Tuesday, that the Minnesota RØKKR are reportedly merging with G2 Esports. But the plan reportedly is to keep the Minnesota RØKKR branding in place in the CDL, which would be pretty interesting. Obviously G2 is a really big brand in esports. Used to be part of like the top Valorant league. Are they a part of the LEC still? I can't. I know they had like a lot of drama around Ocelot or Carlos.
G2, yeah, G2 just won the.
All right.
Yeah, season, I believe.
I mean, that shows you how much I follow League Esports, but they had a lot of drama. I don't even know when that was. The time has been passing by so weirdly, but he kind of got bumped out as more of like a figurehead, and that kept them out of the Valorant partner league reportedly, because Riot didn't want a person like cohabitating with Andrew Tate to be a part of it. Is a whole big thing. But G2 looking to be a part of the CDL, which would be interesting. I think the only time when they had Chino on that roster. Like I don't remember them being a part of COD really other than that.
They tried to qualify for the CWL, and I think they had like Decimate, Blasts, Methods. I think maybe even Lacefield was on it. Like they had a whole bunch of like decent names. I'm pretty sure they lost. It might not have been round 11, but I'm pretty sure they lost a game 5 search to like Red Reserve, and I'm pretty sure it was like, and because it was Black Ops 4, I think it was like the Annihilator pistol, which was like the one-shot specialist pistol. I believe that was still allowed at the time, and I think it was Rated who like got a couple kills with it and like whatever round it was to eliminate G2, and I don't remember if that was Red Reserve or whatnot. My vague memory of the situation, but that's what I remember at least from G2. They tried to qualify for the CWL and they didn't.
Yeah, so they haven't had any success in Call of Duty so far, and I know that they tried with Chino. I think that might have been World War II, maybe, but they had obviously no real success there, and they've not been a part of it other than those brief periods. But it looks like they might be merging with the Minnesota RØKKR, which would be very interesting. Of course, we heard about the RØKKR's potential roster based around accuracy, and I think we discussed it. How we at least I didn't think that it had a lot of potential as like a championship roster, but in the same vein, like accuracy is somebody that Minnesota, the RØKKR organization, is familiar with, and they might be able to kind of build around that. What did you think of this report that G2 is potentially merging with Minnesota RØKKR?
Yeah, so for me, the biggest thing that stood out to me was it felt like the report was like almost insinuating that the merger was a done deal, but the brand change was essentially what the report was on. It felt a little weird to me. Because obviously we haven't heard much about the merger. Like if the report was on the merger and then the additional note was that they could potentially keep the RØKKR brand, that would have made sense to me. But maybe I'm just reading too much into it. At the end of the day, though, I think we've heard the reports from earlier this year about version 1 / the RØKKR potentially looking to sell or merge to keep them around, and we've talked about it on the pod how much we like the RØKKR. Think they've done a good job as a team coming in from outside of Call of Duty previous to the CDL, creating a brand, doing good stuff with social media and the watch parties and all that stuff. So for them to find a way to stay in the league is definitely a positive in my eyes. And kind of similar to what we were talking about with Heretics, G2 as an organization, just due to their success in the LEC, has some more of those global fans who could potentially migrate over to the CDL now. So that's a potential positive as well. The branding thing is an interesting aspect of this to me. So in Dexerto's report, it's version 1 CEO Brett Diamond confirmed to Dexerto that nothing is changing for the upcoming season, but declined to confirm or deny the possibility of a change next year. This is in regards to the RØKKR branding. So that would be interesting. It doesn't sound like we will have like Minnesota G2 or anything for this year. But after the 2024 season, we could potentially have another rebrand, which is like what we got. Optic Los Angeles, the Huntsman, Dallas Empire, the Mutineers, Paris Legion. We've already had a handful of rebrands, and there could be another one added next year. So, I think overall, if this merger comes to fruition and it helps the RØKKR brand and the organization stick around, then I think that's a positive. Just because, again, I think they do a good job. With branding and all that stuff. So that's where I'm at in this situation. We kind of touched on it previously. I think the reported roster is Accuracy, Awakening, Vivid, and Lens. So nothing new on that front that I've heard. Some questions around the roles and stuff for that roster, how that'll all work out, but we can talk about that at another time once we know for sure if that is the roster or not.
I think the most interesting thing for me, of course, the merger just happening would be interesting because who knows how that changes things. But with the branding aspect of it, could it be that, oh, we're not going to rebrand this year because we're getting rid of these stupid team names after this season? Like, because the Heretics would not have to change very much. Like the Miami Heretics, they would just drop that Miami part. Atlanta FaZe, they would just drop the Atlanta part. Optic Texas, they just drop the Texas part. Like, that seems like the most logical thing. It would be like, why would we rebrand and kind of like try to create a new brand or do anything different for this coming season when we could just wait and see how these things go? And if we have to transition to another league or really shake up the structure or kind of the foundation of this league, then we can do that, and we could just be G2 Esports. We don't have to be Minnesota G2 or anything. We could just be ourselves, which I think has been one of the things that I have been so vocal about this year, that it just doesn't make sense for these organizations like Optic and FaZe and 100 Thieves. If G2 Esports were to come into the fold, like these organizations probably would just be better off using these kind of like, I wouldn't say 100 Thieves is historic, but Optic and Optic and FaZe are historic gaming and esports brands that if they just could be Optic Gaming or Optic in general, or they could just be FaZe Clan or FaZe in general, that would be better than tying them to cities. And maybe that's the case, maybe it's not, but that's where my mind is for something like this if G2 and Minnesota RØKKR did end up merging and kind of figuring this out. But yeah, that would be at least half, because I was trying to think of it when you were talking, and it's probably easier to think about the teams that haven't rebranded or been sold. And I'm thinking that New York, London, Seattle, Toronto Ultra, LAG, and Atlanta FaZe. I think that's it. Because you have the Legion moved, so they were Paris to Vegas. Optic LA became LAT. Optic Chicago, Envy, Empire, blah blah blah. Those have changed. Now the Heretics. If Minnesota did change, so I didn't name it but Minnesota is the same as they were before. But if they did change, and if G2 came in part of it. And then Boston, of course, coming in as a new team. So half the league has been changed at some point, or could change with Minnesota. And
London could potentially change too, reportedly.
It could be the Carolina Ravens. You never know.
Mm-hmm. Carolina Panthers, Carolina Pumas.
Well, that's a good one. I mean, they might have to get a Puma sponsorship, but that's about it. Honestly, I like the team names in the sense that it's very easy to like remember them because they're all kind of stupid generic names. But like, I could probably remember the other names too if I had to. Like I could remember Luminosity. I could remember, I think Rogue is the London Royal Ravens equivalent. So I could remember that. I could remember, what do they call? It's NYXL, I think, for the subliners, which I actually like the subliners better, but.
Yeah, it was Inbox, I think so.
Yeah, and then they changed their, I think it's their Overwatch League team used to be the New York Excelsior, and that was like NYXL abbreviated, but then they were like, no, let's just make it Excelsior, and now I think their parent org is NYXL. That's very confusing. Don't do that. That is my worst nightmare as like a writer. If I have to remember these different parent org names, not a fan of that. But the Guard is not a good name. Just kind of running through the parent org names, that's not a good name for a parent org. Neither is version 1, because I just think of Matt Hardy version 1 as a WWE fan back in like 03, so that's what I remember him from. Luminosity's better than Surge. Any thoughts on these? Envy is better than Optic. Hot take.
Wow.
I was always more of a boys in blue thing than a green wall, which wasn't actually true because I was a big timer fan back in the day. So
that's a good person to be a fan of.
Yeah. Back on topic, I think. Let's talk about a little bit of Control. We got a little bit of time left, but apparently the league has had some serious conversations. So I'll just quote from our boy Crone at Intel CDL. Quote, the league had serious discussions on getting rid of Control as a third game mode last season and playing either 3 hardpoints or 3 search and destroys instead. Your thoughts, because I know we've had this conversation before, maybe not on the podcast, but maybe like in Slack or something, because I've always thought that the third game mode almost always sucks, and that we should just play 2 hard points and 3 S&Ds, and if the league is overrun by S&D nerds, then so be it. That's my point of view. What's your take?
I would love, especially in MW3 coming up, with a system where we're with maps in place where we know CTF has worked and been played at a competitive level back in 2009 or whatever it was. I would love to see a return of CTF. But if that's not an option, and we are talking about potentially removing control to do 3 hard points and 3 S&Ds, you know me, I'm a big S&D guy, so I would definitely prefer to see 3 S&Ds. But it brings an interesting point. Just if you listen to the clip that Crone shared from the podcast with Crowder and Ben Nassim and Octane and all them, it sounded like the discussions were potentially not picking 3 hard points or 3 S&Ds as a set format. It sounded like it potentially could have been part of the veto system,
That's what
and that is an exciting prospect to me, because I always am interested in the vetoes and thoughts behind that and stuff. And that's at probably a more basic level when it's only maps, right? Like Optic sucks at one map. You're not going to veto that because you think you have a good chance against them. But at the same time, Optic might know they suck at one map and they're going to veto it themselves because they just don't want to play it. We saw it, historically. First example that comes to mind is LA Thieves during their champs run. They just didn't play Bokage because they were like, well, screw that map. We don't want to play Bokage. But if a map or if a mode selection gets thrown into the veto process, that makes the veto process that much more important. And we've talked about in the past with like the best of 7s and the best of 9s and grand finals and stuff without there being like true double elimination or a bracket reset. Is there enough of an advantage in the grand finals for the team that comes through winners and stuff? If there was a system like this in place where like part of the veto system is determining what modes are played, I think that's a much bigger advantage than just picking the maps, because it might not be a great example because I think Atlanta FaZe at times has been good at hardpoint and S&D separately, but just for the sake of argument, they were really good at search this year. So just for the sake of the argument, if Atlanta FaZe makes it through the winners bracket, and has a chance to pick, like if the best of 7 has 4 S&Ds or 4 hard points, they are probably going to pick 4 S&Ds because they just know they're really good at S&D. But there is also a strategic element, and this is getting a little off topic to the regular best of 5s just now, looking at the grand finals. There is a strategic element to that in the sense of even if you're really good at search, let's just say that one team is really good at a map that you're not as good at, and maybe it's like your veto, you might be more enticed to, roll the dice and go with 4 hard points. So I just think there's a lot of exciting possibilities in terms of the veto, and unfortunately, the downside to it is I feel like we wouldn't really hear a lot about it in terms of what went into each, series map and mode selection sort of thing, unless the teams were like talking about it publicly on social media after matches and stuff,
or they might
or if we were able to get interviews and stuff. But I think that's the only downside I can think of. I think other than that, that's kind of like a selfish downside for me personally. But I do think it's an exciting possibility. I feel like since Black Ops 4, I think Control was cool in Black Ops 4 with the specialist 5v5, more health and stuff like that. I think it worked, but I don't think Control has really been that successful since moving back to 4v4 and in these more recent games. So I would not be opposed to seeing some kind of format change where there's multiple or potentially 3 S&Ds and even 3 hard points in the series. I do think there's a lot of exciting possibilities behind that. It'll just come down to what the players are able to agree on and that sort of thing. But I do think we are at an advantage this year, at least for the start of the season, knowing that the 16 maps at launch for competitive are all maps that, are available for the players to play on backwards compatible. In the case of Clayster and some of the older pros, they are maps that they've already played on in the past. So you can kind of get an early jump on potentially talking about what the map pool might look at the same time, Hardpoint did not exist when the original MW2 and those maps were available. So that's going to be a big, talking point in determining the map set for Hardpoint at least. What maps does that mode work on and all that stuff. So lot of I kind of got a little more excited than I was expecting to talking about this here, but I think there are a lot of exciting prospects with the possibility of not having control, and even if we do keep control, there's a lot of things to look forward to with this map set, especially for someone like me who played that original MW2 and is excited about seeing those maps played again at a professional level. So looking forward to that whenever the start of the season gets around, and hopefully we'll get some updates from Daniel and the CDL before the season gets going, and we'll have more to talk about on that front.
Yeah, I'm just a big fan of like the hardpoint search meta in the sense of like that those are the only two game modes that are consistently strong and competitive. And like strong is a relative word because some of the hardpoint maps are bad. Some of the S&D maps are bad. But I think every single year we deal with control or in Ghosts we were dealing with blitz and domination we've dealt with and uplink and in CTF of course, but we just can't get a consistent one that is good because control a lot of the times is just a defense, like defense wins 4 rounds and then whoever got the most kills, they get defense on the 5th round and then they win. Of course, there are anomalies to that, there are exceptions to that, but if you look at the defensive win percentages for control, it's kind of ridiculous. Like defense shouldn't be that. If you think about it in like a traditional sport, if you have the better defense, but you have a weak offense, but you're still able to win all of those games, it's not a very exciting way to play football or play basketball. That's not what people really want to see. They want to see offense. That's what drives, like we see it in the NFL right now. Like as good as TJ Watt is for the Pittsburgh Steelers, people are a little more excited to watch Patrick Mahomes play and throw the ball around for the Kansas City Chiefs because offense is just more exciting. And I feel like that's the same way with Call of Duty. Like people want to see long sprees or breaking hills. Like that's very exciting versus, oh, they really held that control point very well and they squad wiped them because they hold 2 choke points and that's pretty much the entire way to win this map. And with hardpoint, like it's a little fluky because of the spawns and everything that have been really, really bad for the past several years. But at the end of the day, like hardpoint is a competitive staple and it has been pretty much aside from Ghost, which I think didn't have hardpoint, but everything since Black Ops 2 has had hardpoint as kind of like a staple of competitive. And S&D, of course, has been a staple for as long as competitive has been around. So I would even expand if you can, I would expand it from a best of 5 to a best of 7. And then you could hopefully play 3 hard points and 4 S&Ds. I think that would be the preferable way to do it. Just because I think S&D is so much more exciting when you get to the last game of a series, rather than if you had 4 hard points, you would have to finish on a hard point. And that's probably not as exciting. But I think hardpoint and S&D are the way to go.
That is what one thing I wanted to say and I forgot to mention was that I feel like the only downside to doing 3 hard points is I don't know how you would really do it because I feel like that would be almost too big of an advantage if like Optic, let's just say, is a really strong hardpoint team. And what I'm trying to say is I wouldn't want to see a game 5 not be a search. I think the last game of a series should always be a search. That's just so exciting and has so many high octane moments, especially, game 5, round 11 is just a staple. So in a world where there's only 2 searches and 3 hard points, how do you do that series? Because going back to the example I was just saying, if Optic is a really good hard point team and they decide to do 3 hard points and 2 S&Ds, they could in theory put, if S&D stays game 5, then it's like game 1 hardpoint, game 2 search, hardpoint for 3-4. Then they potentially don't even have to play a second S&D because they just win 3 hardpoints. And I don't know how I feel about that. And I wouldn't feel, I wouldn't want to see a hardpoint go to game 5 in a 3 hardpoint series where it's hardpoint, search, hardpoint, search, hardpoint. So that's one thing that I was thinking about when we were talking about this. I do think no matter what, that search should be the last game mode in a series. It's just finding a balance in a world where there is only 2 modes. If there's potentially, 3 hardpoints played. If there's 3 searches, you could very easily just do hardpoint. Actually,
Search.
you'd probably have to do search, hardpoint, search.
Which wouldn't actually be bad. To start and end on a search would be kind of like a breath of fresh air, because we've, for the past like however many years, it's always been hardpoint opens the series, and then you go to the first search of the series, and then whatever third game mode you have. So if for some reason we kick off the next CDL season and they're like, yep, we're starting with a search and destroy map, like that kind of changes things, just like the flow of a series. And the only other thing that I had about this was we've always talked about how control is such a swing game mode, because like hardpoint and search, like you go hardpoint search and then you completely change what's going on in the series and you go to control, or you go to uplink back in the day, or a CTF, and then you go back to hardpoint and search. Like the difference in that third game mode is just like, it's like where people turn the series on their heads, and that's why we see a lot of reverse sweeps. I wonder if it would be any different if we started with a search and we had another search in game 3. Would there be more sweeps then, or would we still see like the same number of like reverse sweeps, or teams forcing a game 5 or a game 7 or whatever? I just think it's an interesting thing. I'm fully in support of that. If there are just 2 game modes in the next CDL season, I think that would be the way to go. Like I said though, I would try, if possible, and it's probably not possible, but expanding it to 7 games in a series. So the first to 4 would be probably preferable. And I think it would reduce some of the complaints from the players that would inevitably come, because a lot of people have been very critical of the best of 5 series, and how a lot of times like you play one BO5 and then you're done, and that's kind of your day. And if you're at a tournament and you start in the losers bracket, you could play 3 maps and just be flying back home that night. And it just, maybe one extra map or a few extra maps there could help kind of decide who's the better teams, and maybe reduce some of the flukiness, which that's why I think it's preferable to play 4 S&Ds over 4 hardpoints, just because you wouldn't have to deal with as many spawns. Like a 4 hardpoint series, the spawns are probably going to be so ridiculous on some of those maps. But that's obviously just me and kind of my opinion on it. I don't know if you have anything else before we move on. Last thing, we'll just briefly mention it before we get out of here. The Clayster interview. He was on, what podcast was this? The Exclusive podcast, and he talked about quite a few things, including his departure from the New York Subliners last season, not this past season, but in 2022. And he claimed that he was the second best player in Call of Duty history, behind Crimsix, who he discussed quite a bit in that podcast. And he talked about how, like, the state of COD nowadays and kind of where he thinks it is. Anything jump out to you, and anything that you want to discuss from this Clayster subsection of topics?
No, nothing in particular. I haven't gotten a chance to listen to the full thing yet, and I've wanted to. There was, that little juicy bit about, talking about the drama behind NYSL earlier in the 2022 season, where, Clayster and Krim were both on the team. Then there was like some internal talks about I feel like at that time there was drama around whether they were going to keep Clay or Crim. And it turned out Clay gets benched, and obviously there was the whole saga after that fact between Crim and Hydra that played out, and then Subliners win World Championship this year, so end of the day it worked out for them. But there are some interesting tidbits I do want to go back through and listen to that whole thing. But one part you did mention is Clay potentially saying he's the second best player of all time in COD. I wouldn't be opposed to him having that judgment. A lot of people feel like Scump is arguably the second best player of all time, and the one thing that kind of holds him back in that regard is just the World Championships, him only having one, Clay and Karma both having three alongside Crim. So if you want to have Clay in the number 2 spot because he's one of the 3 players with 3 World Championships, then I am definitely fine with that. But as we have also talked about multiple times on this podcast, as much as guys like you and me really enjoy the longtime veterans and stuff like that, the current day conversation around who's the GOAT and top 5s and all that could very rapidly, and even as early as this next year, change in a world where Simp and Abizi win another World Championship and get their 3rd ring. I think when it's all said and done, they are easily going to be fighting each other for the number 1 and 1A, 1B, and in top players of all time. But there will always be the debate because of how many championships Crim has, and taking into account how it's just not going to be possible to really get to a number like that nowadays with the lack of tournaments in comparison to how many tournaments there were back in the last days when Crim was at his peak. So a lot of stuff involving this conversation. I definitely want to go back and give that interview a full listen. But Clay's always a good guy to listen to, just talking about anything in general. I feel like he's a really good mind for the game and a lot of things surrounding it. So I definitely recommend giving that a listen if you guys are interested.
Yeah, I think he has a good argument for being the best or second best, whatever you want to say. As it's only him, Karma, and Crim as the 3-time champs. Like that pretty much is like that speaks for itself. Like it's just a very difficult thing to do. And of course, we could, like you said, have this conversation again. If Abizi and Simp win their 3rd, then it's kind of like, okay, like are they now like in that conversation, or are they at the top or whatever? I think there are like, it's gonna be like a new versus old head kind of conversation, regardless of when and where it happens, because Simp and Abizi are always going to be looked at as like, well, it was a lot easier for them to win champs because they played a few series to win, like in 2021, and they didn't have to go through the 32 team tournaments that like Complexity did or something like that, or Denial Esports did. But I think Clay's kind of best argument is that he has been on so many teams and he's made pretty much all of them better in some manner, and he's won championships with Denial, who was not seen as like, oh, that's a championship like roster going into AW, and they won champs. Of course, E United was a different situation in how they picked up Simp mid-season and then just won pretty much every tournament aside from like their first that they had Simp. So like I guess that changes things. And of course, the Empire was the 5-person team, and that it was a really, really good roster that they had. But I don't know, like I like to compare Scump to LeBron in the sense that like their championships don't kind of hold up to the GOAT status, right? Like LeBron has 4, MJ has 6. Like everybody's just gonna be like, MJ's better. He has 2 more than LeBron, and maybe they're right. And Scump has 1 world championship. Crim, Karma, and Clay all have 3. So like Scump kind of gets put down on that, and because he doesn't have the world championships that they do, even though I don't think there's a lot of argument that Scump is one of, if not the most talented Call of Duty player ever. Like he was kind of like Simp, but before Simp in a way. He was kind of ridiculous at 16, 17 years old and was one of the best players, or I think he probably was the best player when he was like 18, 19 years old, which is very akin to simp. So, but not to get too far off topic, but yeah, I think that's another topic for another day, as far as like the GOAT conversation. And even the COD isn't COD one as well. Maybe that we save that for the next episode, because we don't really know who's going to be announcing rosters or what's going to kind of be in the news in 2 weeks, but that might be something to talk about. And to just briefly touch on the Crim Clay stuff, it seems like they've kind of moved past it. I don't think it's like a problem with them anymore, but it's just so not surprising that those two people would butt heads so much in a team environment, that they're trying to drop each other from the team, that they're like, I don't want to play with him, and the other guy's like, well, I don't really want to play with him either, and they're both going to management to complain about it, and that like the chips fall where they may, and it ended up being that Clay got benched and Crim ended up having a lot of drama with Hydra at the end of the season, but that's kind of how it goes. And the New York Subliners, like you said, won a world championship, so it was kind of all is well that ends well for the Subliners. Anything else before we get out of here? Yeah, make sure to like, subscribe, or follow the podcast wherever you're listening on. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube as well. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the videos. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers. The podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. We will be off next week. Happy Labor Day, early Labor Day to anybody listening. So we'll be off for Labor Day a week, and then we'll be back the following week. I think that's the week of the 11th. We'll be back with a new episode. Like I said, kind of depends on what's being discussed. We might just have an off-season pod where I tell you why Doug Sensor Martin is the best player in Call of Duty history, and then Bink also agrees with me, and there are no notes, and it's a 3-minute podcast, and we kind of get out of here. But we'll see what happens over the next 2 weeks. We'll come up with a show. We'll talk about something COD related, or Valorant related, because I guess it's the Valorant podcast now. And we'll do a show in 2 weeks from now. But yeah, that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Short and sweet this week. Thank you guys as always for the support. Really appreciate it. We will see you guys whenever we're back. Hopefully we have some juicy stuff to talk about. And until then, remember to send the chow.